Hello everyone. If you love heartwarming animal stories and want to follow the inspiring journey of these adorable friends, don't forget to hit the subscribe button now so you won't miss any of our videos. Now, let's dive into today's emotional story. Tommy's world was small, gray, and unforgiving. He lived in a rundown apartment at the edge of town, where the streets were cracked and lifeless, lined with broken streetlights that flickered at night like dying stars. The buildings around him looked just as tired as the people who lived inside them, old, weary, and forgotten. His apartment was no different. The wallpaper peeled from the walls, revealing water stains underneath. The pipes rattled when the heater tried to work, but it never did. The floors creaked beneath every step, but it wasn't the noise that scared Tommy. It was his father. A man who had once been full of dreams but had lost them somewhere along the way. A man who now drowned his regrets in bottles of cheap whiskey and let his anger spill over onto the only person left in his life, his son. Tommy had learned early on that love could turn into pain faster than a blink. His mother had left when he was just 5. He didn't remember much about her, just faint whispers of a gentle voice, the scent of lavender, and the way she used to hum when she cooked. But all of that had disappeared, along with any warmth in their home. His father never spoke about her, never mentioned her name. But Tommy knew, she was the first one to run, and maybe one day, he'd be next. Until then, he survived. He had learned to make himself small, to avoid eye contact, to move silently through the house so he wouldn't give his father a reason to look at him. But some nights, it didn't matter. Some nights, the bottles emptied too quickly. Some nights, anger found him anyway. And Tommy had nowhere to go. At school, he was just another shadow in the hallway, a boy that no one noticed. He wasn't the kid who got bullied, at least, not in the way that left bruises. He was just ignored. No friends. No one to sit with at lunch. No one who would ask if he was okay. And that was fine. Better to be invisible than to be seen and hurt. His teachers didn't ask about the bruises that sometimes bloomed across his arms, and if they noticed the way he winced when he moved, they never said anything. And Tommy never told. Because what was the point? No one cared. So, he kept his head down. He walked home alone every day, hands shoved deep into the pockets of his oversized hoodie, shoulders hunched, moving quickly through the streets like a ghost trying not to be seen. That was the rule. Don't trust. Don't hope. Don't feel. And for the longest time, it worked. Until the day he met the dog. It had been one of those bitter autumn days, where the sky was heavy and gray, and the air smelled like a storm was coming. Tommy had stopped by the small corner store to steal a pack of crackers, not because he wanted to, but because dinner was never a guarantee at home. As he walked down the alley behind the store, he heard something that made him stop in his tracks. A sound so faint, so weak, he almost thought he had imagined it. A whimper. He turned his head, eyes scanning the alleyway. At first, he saw nothing but garbage bags and broken crates. But then, in the shadows, he saw it. A dog. Small. Thin. Dirty. Hurt. Its fur was tangled, its ribs showing through its filthy coat. It lay curled up near the dumpster, shaking, its breathing shallow. Tommy's stomach twisted. He wasn't a dog person. He wasn't even a people person. And yet, Something about those eyes made him freeze. They weren't just eyes full of pain. They were eyes full of quiet acceptance. Like it had already given up. Like it had already learned the same lesson Tommy had: the world was cruel, and no one was coming to save them. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to look away. He wasn't a hero. He could barely save himself. So he kept walking. He made it to the end of the alley. Made it halfway down the street. Then the first raindrop hit his cheek. Then another. Within seconds, the sky opened up, and the rain poured down in sheets. Tommy hunched his shoulders and walked faster. Then, from behind him, a soft, broken whimper. Tommy stopped. He squeezed his eyes shut, his fists clenching. No. No. Just keep walking. But then he thought about the way that dog had looked at him. Like it understood him. Like it had already accepted that no one cared. Something inside Tommy cracked. He turned around, his feet moving before his brain could catch up. When he reached the dog, it was barely moving. The rain had drenched its thin body, making it shiver even harder. Tommy hesitated. Then, with a quiet sigh, he unzipped his hoodie and draped it over the dog. The small creature whined softly, pressing into the warmth. Tommy swallowed the lump in his throat. He couldn't believe what he was about to do. Fine. But just for tonight. He bent down, carefully scooped the dog into his arms, and walked home. And just like that, everything began to change. Carrying the dog home was harder than Tommy expected. The creature was so light, too light. It was as if he was carrying nothing but bones and fur, barely held together by a fragile will to live. With each weak breath, its ribs expanded and contracted beneath Tommy's arms, and the warmth of its small body seeped into his chest like an unfamiliar feeling. He hated how much he cared already. If his father found out, he'd throw the dog out without a second thought. Or worse. Tommy tightened his grip, moving swiftly through the rain-soaked streets. The storm had turned heavier, and by the time he reached his apartment building, his clothes were soaked through. He hesitated at the entrance. How was he going to sneak this thing in? The hallways of their complex echoed with every footstep, and his father had sharp ears, even when he was drinking. Tommy took a deep breath, pressed the dog closer to his chest, and walked in. The apartment was dark when he entered. Good. His father was either passed out or hadn't come home yet. Either way, it bought Tommy time. Carefully, he tiptoed to his room, nudging the door shut behind him with his foot. Now what? He turned on his small lamp, casting a dim glow over his tiny space: bare walls, a thin mattress, a single shelf of books, and a closet that barely held anything. He didn't own much. But tonight, he had something that needed him. Tommy laid the dog on his old blanket in the corner of the room. Up close, it looked even worse than before. Its fur was matted with dirt, and its paws were scraped raw, likely from walking too far without rest. He knelt beside it. "Why are you so messed up, he muttered, more to himself than to the dog. The dog lifted its head slightly at the sound of his voice, its tail giving the faintest wag. Tommy's throat tightened. He had never had anyone look at him like that before, like he was worth something. He swallowed hard. "You need food," he said, standing up quickly. His father rarely left much food in the house, but Tommy had learned how to survive on scraps. He snuck into the kitchen, careful to not make a sound, and grabbed a piece of stale bread and a leftover slice of cold chicken. When he returned, the dog's ears perked up, its nose twitching as it caught the scent. Tommy tore the chicken into tiny pieces and placed them in front of the dog. At first, it hesitated. Maybe it didn't trust him yet. Then, slowly, it leaned forward and started eating, first cautiously, then more eagerly, as if realizing food wasn't just a dream. Tommy watched in silence. His stomach twisted. He knew what it felt like to be that hungry. What was he doing? He couldn't keep it. He wasn't meant to take care of things. But when the dog finished eating, it crawled toward him, pressing its small body against his leg. Warm. Alive. Trusting. Tommy's fingers curled into the blanket. He didn't deserve this kind of trust. And yet, he didn't move away. That night, Tommy sat on his bed, watching the dog curl up in the corner, its breathing slow and steady. It wasn't shaking anymore. It was safe. He never had a pet before. Never even wanted one. But something about this creature, the way it had looked at him, the way it had stayed close even after he'd tried to ignore it, made him feel different. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he thought. The dog lifted its head slightly, blinking at him with big, tired eyes. Tommy sighed. "Guess you need a name," he muttered. Names meant attachment. Names meant keeping things. And yet, after a moment, he found himself whispering, "Buddy." The dog's ears twitched. Then, to Tommy's surprise, its tail gave a weak but happy wag. His chest ached at the sight. "You like that, huh?" Buddy wagged his tail again. Tommy sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Great. Now I'm stuck with you." But he didn't really mean it. Because for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like the only broken thing in the world. And that made it a little easier to breathe. Days passed. Tommy did his best to hide Buddy. He snuck food whenever he could, cleaned his wounds, and made sure he stayed quiet when his father was home. The dog grew stronger, and so did something inside Tommy. For the first time, he had something to come home to. Buddy was always there, waiting for him, wagging his tail like Tommy was the best thing he'd ever seen. And slowly, Tommy started to believe it. But deep down, he knew it couldn't last. Nothing good ever did. Tommy had never been happier. For the first time in his life, he had something to hold on to, someone who didn't judge him, someone who didn't hurt him. Buddy. The little dog grew stronger every day. His ribs weren't as visible anymore, and his coat, though still rough, was starting to shine. Tommy did his best to take care of him, sneaking food, cleaning his fur with an old cloth, whispering stories to him late at night when the world felt too heavy. And Buddy? Buddy listened. He would lay his head on Tommy's lap, his brown eyes full of understanding, as if he knew every painful secret Tommy had never said out loud. It was a silent promise. You're not alone anymore. For once, Tommy allowed himself to believe it. But deep down, he knew, nothing good ever lasted. And he was right. It happened on a Wednesday. Tommy had rushed home after school, eager to see Buddy, as always. He had stopped by the store on the way, stuffing a small piece of leftover sandwich into his pocket, just something to share with Buddy. But the second he stepped into the apartment, his stomach dropped. The door to his room was open. Wide open. And his father was standing inside. For a split second, Tommy couldn't breathe. His father's face was dark with anger. His knuckles were white, gripping an old beer bottle. And at his feet, Buddy was cowering, his tail tucked between his legs. "What the hell is this?" his father growled. Tommy's mouth was dry. His hands shook as he instinctively stepped forward, placing himself between Buddy and the man who had never shown kindness to anything. I found him," Tommy admitted, voice barely above a whisper. He was hurt. "I was just trying to help." His father scoffed. "You can't even help yourself, and you're bringing home a damn stray?" Tommy clenched his fists. "Don't talk back. Don't make it worse." But when his father raised the beer bottle, stepping toward Buddy, Tommy snapped. "Don't touch him," he yelled, louder than he had ever dared before. A terrible silence followed. His father's gaze slowly shifted from Buddy to him. And Tommy knew he had just made the worst mistake of his life. It happened fast. A sharp smack echoed through the room. Tommy stumbled back, his cheek burning where his father had struck him. He refused to cry. He wouldn't give him that. Buddy let out a low growl. His father glared down at the dog. "You want to keep this mutt? Fine. But don't expect me to feed it. You can barely take care of yourself." Then he turned and left, slamming the door behind him. Tommy stood frozen, his breath shaking. Buddy crawled toward him, whining softly, licking his hand as if trying to erase the pain. Tommy sank to his knees, pressing his forehead against Buddy's fur. "It's okay," he whispered. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Nothing was okay. That night, Tommy lay awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind wouldn't stop racing. His father had seen Buddy now. That meant he wasn't safe. And Tommy knew, if his father changed his mind, if he got drunk enough, if he got angry enough, he would get rid of Buddy. Or worse. Tommy's stomach twisted. He couldn't let that happen. So there was only one choice left. A painful, unbearable choice. With tears burning in his eyes, he whispered into the darkness, "I have to let you go." Buddy lifted his head, his ears twitching at Tommy's voice. He didn't understand. But tomorrow, he would. Tomorrow, Tommy would set him free. The next morning, Tommy felt like his heart was breaking. The decision had been made. He had spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to Buddy's gentle breathing beside him, trying to convince himself that this was the only way. His father knew now. And that meant Buddy wasn't safe anymore. Tommy couldn't let him get hurt. He wouldn't. So as soon as the sun rose, he gently shook Buddy awake. "Come on, boy," he whispered, his voice hollow. "We're going for a walk." Buddy stretched, wagging his tail sleepily, unaware of what was happening. Tommy swallowed the lump in his throat and grabbed his hoodie. Then, with every step feeling like lead, he led Buddy outside. Tommy walked until he reached the edge of town, where the streets turned into open fields and where the world felt just a little quieter. This was it. This was where he would say goodbye. He knelt down, running a shaky hand over Buddy's fur. "You're gonna be okay," he whispered. "You'll find someone better. Someone who can take care of you." Buddy licked Tommy's hand, trusting him completely. Tommy's chest ached. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the last piece of bread he had saved from the night before. "Here," he said, placing it in front of Buddy. "One last meal before you go." Buddy sniffed it but didn't eat. Instead, he just sat there, tilting his head, watching Tommy carefully. Like he knew. Like he understood. Tommy's hands trembled as he reached for Buddy's collar, slowly loosening it. Tears blurred his vision, but he refused to let them fall. "You'll be okay," he repeated. "You'll find a better home." Then he stood up and turned away. And he walked. 1 step. 2 steps. 3. Then, a soft whimper behind him. Tommy squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself not to turn back. "Keep walking. Keep walking. Keep walking." Then, pause against the pavement. Running. Before Tommy could stop him, Buddy had launched himself forward, wrapping around Tommy's legs, his small body trembling. He wasn't leaving. He refused to leave. Tommy bit down on his lip so hard it bled. Why did he have to make this so hard? Why couldn't Buddy just go? Why did he still believe in Tommy, when Tommy didn't even believe in himself? Tommy fell to his knees, burying his face in Buddy's fur, finally letting the tears fall. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry." Buddy pressed closer, licking away Tommy's tears. And in that moment, Tommy knew. He couldn't do it. He couldn't let him go. No matter what happened, they would face it together. By the time Tommy got home, his father was waiting. The moment Tommy stepped inside, his father's eyes narrowed at Buddy. "I thought I told you to get rid of that thing," he muttered, his voice already thick with morning whiskey. Tommy held his ground. He had never dared to fight back before. But this time was different. Buddy was different. "He stays," Tommy said, his voice stronger than he expected. His father's face darkened. "What did you just say?" Tommy's heart pounded, but he clenched his fists. "I said he stays." For a moment, his father just stared at him. Then, with a sharp laugh, he turned back toward the couch, grabbing another bottle. "Do whatever you want," he muttered. "I don't care." Tommy let out a shaky breath. He had won. Buddy was safe. And for the first time in his life, Tommy felt like he had stood up for something that mattered. The days passed. Things weren't perfect. His father still drank. He still ignored Tommy. But something had changed. Tommy wasn't alone anymore. He had Buddy. And Buddy had him. For the first time, Tommy felt hope. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. Because when you choose love over fear, even in the darkest places, you find a way to heal. Weeks turned into months. Life didn't change overnight. His father was still distant, still trapped in his own world of regrets and silence. But something was different. There were no more harsh words about Buddy. No more threats to get rid of him. Instead, there were small moments, glimpses of something softer beneath the hardened exterior. Like the way his father would linger by the door, watching as Tommy played with Buddy outside. Or the way he would pause mid-drink, listening to the quiet laughter Tommy hadn't realized he still had in him. And then, one morning, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift. Tommy walked into the kitchen and froze. A bowl of dog food sat on the floor. Buddy, as if sensing something sacred in the moment, wagged his tail but didn't move. His father stood by the counter, his fingers wrapped around a beer can, eyes fixed on the window, avoiding Tommy's gaze. He didn't say a word. But he didn't have to. Tommy smiled. Because sometimes, kindness isn't loud. Sometimes, it's a single unspoken action. And sometimes, it's the start of something new. Message of the story. Choosing kindness over hate doesn't just change the world around us, it heals the wounds within us. Buddy wasn't just a stray dog, he was a symbol of second chances, a reminder that love can grow in even the darkest places. Tommy, once convinced that the world had no kindness left, learned that even the most broken things, a hurt child, a forgotten dog, a distant father, can be mended if someone is willing to try. This story isn't just about rescuing a dog, it's about rescuing each other. Because sometimes, a small act of kindness is all it takes to begin a new story, one where healing, hope, and love find their way back home.